Jake Martinez had always been a dreamer, but his dreams seemed to slip away like sand through his fingers. At 35, he worked double shifts at the auto repair shop in small-town Nevada, his hands permanently stained with grease and his back aching from years of bending over car engines. His wife Maria had left him 2 years ago, taking their daughter Emma with her to California. The divorce papers cited lack of ambition as one of the reasons, words that still stung like a fresh wound every time he thought about them. The only constant companion in Jake's life was his German Shepherd mix, Rex. The dog had wandered into his life 3 years ago, appearing at the repair shop one rainy evening, thin and hungry. Jake had shared his sandwich with the stray, and from that moment Rex never left his side. The dog seemed to understand Jake's moods better than any human ever had, offering silent comfort during the lonely nights when the weight of his failures pressed down like a heavy blanket. Jake lived in a run-down trailer on the outskirts of town, where the rent was cheap but the walls were thin and the heater barely worked during Nevada's cold winters. Every month was a struggle to make ends meet, and he often found himself choosing between groceries and gas money. His dreams of owning land, of having a place where he could breathe freely and maybe start fresh, seemed impossibly distant. One particularly gray Monday morning in October, Jake stumbled into Miller's Diner for his usual cup of coffee before work. The place buzzed with the typical small-town gossip, but today there was something different in the air. Old Pete, the town's unofficial news broadcaster, was holding court at his usual corner booth, his voice carrying across the diner with unusual excitement. "I'm telling you, it's the strangest thing I ever seen," Pete was saying to anyone who would listen. "That old Riverside ranch been sitting empty for near 20 years now. The bank's been trying to sell it forever, but ain't nobody want it. Too far out, too much work needed." Jake's ears perked up despite himself. He'd driven past the Riverside ranch countless times on his way to jobs in the next county. The property sat on about 40 acres of scrubland, with a weathered house, a collapsed barn, and what looked like it might have been a stable once upon a time. It wasn't much to look at, but something about the wide open spaces had always called to him. "What about it, Pete?" asked Sally, the waitress, as she refilled coffee cups around the table. Pete leaned forward conspiratorially. "Bank's so desperate to get rid of it, they're practically giving it away. My cousin works there, says they're willing to take any offer just to get it off their books. Any offer at all." Jake's heart started beating faster. He pulled out his worn wallet and counted the bills inside. 9 crumpled dollars and some loose change. It wasn't much, but Pete's words echoed in his mind. Any offer at all. Rex, who had been lying quietly at Jake's feet, suddenly stood up and padded over to the window. The dog stared out toward the direction of the ranch, his tail wagging slowly as if he could sense something in the distance. Jake had always trusted Rex's instincts. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense things that others missed. Whether it was a car problem before it became obvious or when someone at the shop was having a bad day and needed a gentle nudge from a friendly nose. After work that evening, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the ranch. He drove Rex out to the property as the sun was setting, painting the desert landscape in shades of orange and purple. The old house looked even more run down up close, with broken windows and a sagging porch. The barn had partially collapsed and weeds grew everywhere. But there was something about the place that felt right, like coming home after a long journey. Rex jumped out of the truck and immediately began exploring, his nose to the ground as he investigated every corner of the property. Jake watched his dog's behavior carefully. Rex was acting differently than usual, more focused, more intent. The dog kept circling back to a spot near what used to be the barn, whining softly and pawing at the ground. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, but Rex just continued his investigation, becoming more agitated by the minute. Standing there in the fading light, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He was tired of playing it safe, tired of letting life happen to him instead of taking control. Tomorrow he would go to the bank and make an offer on the Riverside ranch. $9 wasn't much, but it was everything he had, and sometimes everything you have is enough to change your entire world. That night, Jake lay in his trailer bed with Rex curled up beside him, staring at the ceiling and imagining what it would be like to own 40 acres of land. He thought about fixing up the house, maybe getting some chickens, starting a small garden. For the first time in years, he felt something he had almost forgotten existed. Hope. The next morning dawned bright and clear, as if the universe was giving him a sign. Jake, dressed in his cleanest jeans and his only button-up shirt, the one he'd worn to court for his divorce. Rex seemed to sense that something important was happening and stayed close to Jake's side, his intelligent brown eyes following every movement. As Jake prepared to leave for the bank, he looked around his shabby trailer one last time. If this crazy plan worked, if the bank actually accepted his $9 offer, this would be the last morning he woke up in this place. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. Change was scary, but staying the same was scarier. He knelt down and scratched Rex behind the ears. "What do you think, boy? Ready for an adventure?" Rex barked once, sharp and clear, as if to say he was ready for whatever came next. Jake smiled for the first time in weeks. Whatever happened at the bank today, at least he would know he had tried. Sometimes that was all a man could do. The Nevada First National Bank sat on Main Street like a fortress of financial impossibility, its brick facade intimidating to someone like Jake, who had spent more time avoiding banks than visiting them. His hands were sweating as he pushed through the heavy glass doors, Rex waiting patiently in the truck outside. The cool air conditioning hit him like a wall, and for a moment he considered turning around and pretending this whole idea had never occurred to him. Behind the polished marble counter, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair looked up from her computer screen. Her name tag read, Jennifer, Loan Officer, and she wore the kind of smile that Jake had learned meant trouble for people like him. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you today?" Jake cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his work boots and faded jeans among the bank's gleaming surfaces. "I'd like to make an offer on some property. The old Riverside Ranch." Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly and she glanced at her computer screen. "Oh my, that property has been on our books for quite some time. Let me pull up the file." Her fingers clicked across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Yes, here it is. 40 acres, needs significant repairs, been listed for 18 months now." She looked back at Jake with renewed interest. "What kind of offer were you thinking of making, Mr. Martinez?" Jake Martinez. He took a deep breath and pulled out his wallet, placing the 9 crumpled bills on the marble counter between them. $9. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Jennifer stared at the money, then at Jake, then back at the money. Her professional smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "I'm sorry, Mr. Martinez, but I think there might be some misunderstanding. The property is valued at $68,000. Even with our current situation, I don't think—" "I heard you folks were willing to consider any offer," Jake interrupted, his voice steadier than he felt inside. "Any offer at all?" Jennifer's expression shifted from polite confusion to something approaching curiosity. She excused herself and walked to the back office where Jake could see her talking animatedly with an older man in an expensive suit. Their conversation involved a lot of hand gestures and head shaking, with occasional glances in Jake's direction. While he waited, Jake's mind wandered to Rex, who was probably getting restless in the truck. The dog had been acting strange ever since they'd visited the ranch the previous evening. Rex was usually calm and observant, but something about that property had awakened an almost urgent energy in him. Jake trusted his dog's instincts more than his own sometimes, and Rex had definitely been trying to tell him something important. Jennifer returned with the older man, who introduced himself as Mr. Patterson, the branch manager. His handshake was firm, but his expression was skeptical. "Mr. Martinez, I understand you're interested in the Riverside property. Jennifer tells me you've made an unconventional offer." "That's right, sir. $9. It's everything I have right now." Mr. Patterson studied Jake for a long moment. "Son, that property has been nothing but a headache for this bank. We've had it appraised, we've tried auctions. We've lowered the price 3 times. Nobody wants 40 acres of scrubland with buildings that are ready to fall down." "I want it," Jake said simply. "But $9? The taxes alone are more than that every year." Jake had thought about this during his sleepless night. "I'll take over the tax payments. I'll maintain the property. I'll take full responsibility for everything." Mr. Patterson and Jennifer exchanged glances. The older man rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You know what the property looks like, right? You've been out there?" "Yesterday evening. Me and my dog. And you still want it?" "More than I've wanted anything in a long time." There was something in Jake's voice, a quiet desperation mixed with genuine hope, that seemed to reach Mr. Patterson. The banker had spent 30 years watching people's dreams get crushed by financial reality. But every once in a while, someone came along who reminded him why he'd gotten into banking in the first place. Jennifer, pull up our correspondence with the board about this property. As she typed, Mr. Patterson turned back to Jake. 3 months ago, our board of directors gave us authorization to dispose of this property by any means necessary. They're tired of it sitting on our books, costing money every month in maintenance and insurance. Jennifer looked up from her screen. Here it is. Board authorizes disposal of Riverside Ranch property through any reasonable offer that transfers full ownership and liability. Any reasonable offer, Mr. Patterson repeated slowly. The question is, Mr. Martinez, what makes your offer reasonable? Jake had been hoping someone would ask him that question. I'm a mechanic. I know how to fix things. I've got time, I've got motivation, and I've got nowhere else to go. That property needs someone who'll care about it, not just someone with money. What's your plan for the property? Honest, I don't know yet. Fix up the house so it's livable. Maybe get some animals. Start small and see what works. Jake paused, thinking about Rex's behavior the night before. My dog seems to think there's something special about the place. Mr. Patterson actually smiled at that. Your dog, huh? Rex has good instincts. Better than mine, usually. The banker was quiet for a moment, staring at the $9 still sitting on the counter. Finally, he sighed deeply and turned to Jennifer. Draw up the paperwork. Sir? Jennifer looked confused. You heard me. Mr. Martinez is offering to take full ownership and liability of a property that's been costing us money for 2 years. He'll handle the taxes, the maintenance, everything. The board said any reasonable offer that transfers ownership. This is reasonable. Jake felt his knees go weak with relief and disbelief. You're serious? Dead serious. But understand, son, once you sign those papers, that property is yours. Good and bad, whatever's out there is your responsibility. I understand. As Jennifer began printing documents, Mr. Patterson leaned against the counter. You know, in 30 years of banking, I've never seen anything like this. But I've got a feeling about you, Mr. Martinez. Sometimes a person just needs a chance to prove what they're made of. Outside, Rex had his nose pressed against the truck window, watching the bank entrance intently. When Jake finally emerged with a folder full of legal documents and the deed to 40 acres of Nevada scrubland, the dog's tail began wagging so hard it shook the entire truck. Jake spent his first night as a landowner sleeping in the back of his truck, parked right in front of what was now his house. The old building looked even more imposing in the darkness, its broken windows like empty eye sockets staring out at the desert. Rex had insisted on sleeping outside the truck, positioning himself near the collapsed barn where he'd been so interested the day before. When dawn broke over the Nevada landscape, painting everything in soft gold and pink, Jake felt a sense of ownership he'd never experienced before. This was his land, his sky, his sunrise. The feeling was almost overwhelming. His first priority was making the house livable. Jake had brought basic tools from the repair shop, and he spent the morning assessing the damage. The roof needed patching in several places. Most of the windows would need to be replaced, and the plumbing was a disaster. But the foundation was solid, and the walls were structurally sound. It would be a lot of work, but it was work he could handle. Rex, meanwhile, had resumed his investigation of the barn area. The dog was acting even more strangely than before, circling the same spot repeatedly and occasionally letting out small whines of frustration. Jake had never seen his normally calm companion so agitated. What's got into you, boy? Jake called out as he climbed down from inspecting the roof. Rex looked at him and barked once, then went back to pawing at a particular section of ground near the barn's foundation. The area looked different from the surrounding soil somehow, slightly sunken and darker in color. Jake walked over and knelt beside his dog. The ground here was definitely different, softer somehow, as if it had been disturbed at some point and never quite settled back to its original state. He pressed his hand against the earth and it gave slightly under pressure. You think there's something buried here, Rex? The dog's tail wagged furiously and he began digging with renewed energy. His powerful paws sent dirt flying in all directions, creating a small crater in the soft ground. Jake watched with growing curiosity as Rex's hole got deeper and deeper. After about 10 minutes of determined digging, Rex suddenly stopped and backed away from the hole, whimpering softly. Jake peered into the opening his dog had created and saw something that made his heart skip a beat. There, about 2 feet down, was what looked like the corner of a wooden box. Jake ran to his truck and grabbed a proper shovel from his tool collection. His hands were shaking as he carefully began to enlarge the hole, being careful not to damage whatever was buried beneath the soil. Rex sat nearby, watching intently as if supervising the excavation. As more of the object became visible, Jake could see it was indeed a wooden box, about the size of a small chest. The wood was old and weathered but still intact, protected by the dry Nevada soil. There were metal clasps on one side, green with age but still functional. It took Jake nearly an hour to carefully dig out the entire box and lift it from its earthen hiding place. It was heavier than he'd expected, and something inside shifted when he moved it. His heart was pounding as he carried it away from the hole and set it down on a flat section of ground. Rex immediately began sniffing around the box, his tail wagging with excitement. Whatever was inside, the dog approved of it. Jake examined the metal clasps closely. They were old but not rusted shut, as if the box had been designed to be opened again someday. There was no lock, just the two clasps holding the lid in place. Taking a deep breath, Jake opened the box. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be old canvas, were stacks and stacks of money. Not modern bills, but older currency, some of it dating back to the 1950s and 1960s. There had to be thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands, but that wasn't all. Beneath the money was a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Jake carefully lifted it out and opened to the first page where someone had written in faded ink, "If you're reading this, then the ranch has found its way to someone who needs it. This money was meant to be found. Use it wisely. William Riverside." Jake's hands were trembling as he turned the pages. The journal told the story of William Riverside, who had owned the ranch in the 1960s and 1970s. William had been a successful businessman who'd made his money in mining, but he'd always loved the simple life on his small ranch. He'd never married and had no children, spending his later years alone except for his dogs. According to the journal entries, William had become increasingly convinced that the government was going to seize his assets, due to some business dealings from his younger days. Rather than let that happen, he'd withdrawn his savings and buried them on his property, intending to retrieve them when the danger passed. But William had died suddenly of a heart attack in 1978, and the secret of the buried money had died with him. The ranch had eventually been taken by the bank for unpaid taxes, and it had sat empty ever since, waiting for someone worthy to discover its secret. The final entry in the journal was dated just days before William's death. "I buried the money where the old barn foundation meets the sunrise. If something happens to me, I hope someday the right person will find it. Someone who needs a fresh start as much as this old place does." Jake sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by what he'd discovered. The money would solve all his immediate problems and give him the resources to properly restore the ranch. But more than that, he felt a strange connection to William Riverside, a man he'd never met but who seemed to understand exactly what Jake needed. Rex nudged the journal with his nose, then looked up at Jake with what could only be described as satisfaction. Somehow the dog had known this was here. Jake didn't understand how or why, but Rex had led him to exactly what he needed to make his dreams possible. As Jake carefully rewrapped the money and closed the journal, he noticed something else in the bottom of the box, a small tarnished silver dog collar with a name engraved on it, Duke, William's best friend. Jake looked at Rex, who was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. For a moment it was easy to imagine that Rex wasn't just a stray dog who'd wandered into his life, but something more, something sent to guide him to this moment, this place, this discovery. "Well, boy," Jake said softly, scratching Rex behind the ears. "Looks like we both found our home." Rex barked once and wagged his tail, then walked over to stand in the doorway of the old house, looking back at Jake as if to say it was time to get to work. There was a ranch to rebuild, a life to start over, and 40 acres of possibility stretching out under the Nevada sky. The discovery of William Riverside's hidden treasure changed everything for Jake, but it also brought new challenges he hadn't expected. The money totaled $37,000, more than Jake had ever seen in one place. However, he quickly realized that simply depositing such a large amount of old currency into his bank account would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Jake spent 3 sleepless nights reading through William's journal, learning about the man who had owned his ranch decades ago. William had been a careful, methodical person who documented everything in his neat handwriting. The journal revealed that he'd been involved in some questionable business deals in his younger years. Nothing illegal, but ethically gray areas that had made him paranoid about government scrutiny. More importantly, the journal contained detailed plans for the ranch that William had never been able to implement before his death. Sketches showed where he'd planned to build a new barn, upgrade the irrigation system, and even add a small guest cabin near the creek that ran along the property's eastern edge. Jake hadn't even known there was a creek until he read about it and went exploring with Rex. The creek was another surprise. Hidden behind a grove of cottonwood trees, a small stream ran year-round, fed by a natural spring somewhere upstream. William had planned to use this water source to transform part of the scrubland into productive agricultural space. His notes included soil composition studies and crop recommendations that were still relevant today. Rex seemed to know about the creek too, leading Jake directly to it on their first exploration. The dog waded into the shallow water and looked back at Jake as if to say, "See? I told you this place was special." Jake decided to implement William's plan slowly and carefully. He started by taking the oldest bills to a coin and currency dealer in Las Vegas, claiming they'd been left to him by a deceased relative. The dealer was excited by some of the rarer notes and paid Jake even more than their face value, providing him with modern currency and a legitimate paper trail for his sudden wealth. With proper funding secured, Jake began transforming the ranch in earnest. He hired contractors from town to help with the major structural work on the house, but he did most of the detailed work himself. Every morning he would read a section of William's journal, then implement whatever plan seemed most practical. The townspeople began taking notice of the changes happening at the old Riverside Ranch. Jake's story of buying the property for $9 had spread through the small community like wildfire, and people started dropping by to see what the crazy mechanic was doing with his impossible purchase. Martha Henderson, who ran the local hardware store, became one of Jake's biggest supporters. She'd known William Riverside personally and was delighted that someone was finally caring for his beloved property. William would be so happy, she told Jake one afternoon as he loaded lumber into his truck. He always said that place was meant for someone who understood what it could become, not just what it was. Jake had to be careful not to reveal too much about William's journal or the money he'd found. Instead, he told people he was using his savings and working extra shifts at the repair shop to fund the renovations. The story was believable enough that nobody questioned it. Rex proved to be invaluable during the renovation process. The dog seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense problems before they became obvious. He would bark and refuse to leave certain areas where Jake would later discover structural issues or problems with wiring. More than once, Rex's warnings saved Jake from making costly mistakes. One evening in late November, as Jake was installing new windows in the main house, Rex began acting agitated near the foundation on the south side of the building. The dog pawed at a section of concrete and whined persistently until Jake came to investigate. Using a flashlight to examine the area more closely, Jake discovered a crack in the foundation that would have eventually caused serious structural problems. William's journal mentioned that this side of the house had always been prone to settling, and he'd made notes about reinforcing it that Jake hadn't yet implemented. "Good boy, Rex," Jake said, scratching the dog's ears gratefully. "You just saved us a lot of trouble down the road." By December, the house was becoming truly livable. Jake had installed new plumbing, updated the electrical system, and patched the roof. The windows let in warm winter sunlight, and a new heating system kept the rooms comfortable even during Nevada's cold desert nights. But Jake's favorite improvement was the large covered porch he'd built across the front of the house, following William's detailed sketches from the journal. It faced east, catching the sunrise every morning, and provided the perfect spot to sit with a cup of coffee and watch the desert come alive with the new day. Rex had claimed a corner of the porch as his own, positioning his bed where he could keep watch over the entire property. The dog seemed content in a way Jake had never seen before, as if he too had finally found his true home. Word of the ranch's transformation had spread beyond the immediate area, and Jake began receiving unexpected visitors. A reporter from the county newspaper wanted to do a story about the man who'd bought a ranch for $9. A local television station heard about the story and sent a camera crew. Jake was careful to keep his story simple during these interviews. He talked about believing in the potential of overlooked places and the importance of following your dreams, even when they seemed impossible. He never mentioned the buried money or William's journal, though he did speak fondly of the ranch's previous owner based on what he'd learned from Martha Henderson and other longtime residents. The media attention brought some opportunities Jake hadn't expected. A solar energy company offered to install panels on his property at a significant discount in exchange for using the ranch as a demonstration site. A local agricultural extension office reached out about participating in a sustainable farming pilot program. Most surprisingly, Jake received a phone call from his ex-wife, Maria, in California. She'd seen the television story online and wanted to know if it was really him buying a ranch in Nevada. "Jake, I can't believe it's really you," she said during their awkward phone conversation. "You look so different, so happy." "I am happy, Maria. For the first time in a long time. Emma wants to know if she can come visit sometime. She's fascinated by the idea of her dad owning a ranch." The possibility of his daughter visiting filled Jake with both joy and terror. He wanted Emma to see what he was building, but he also worried about disappointing her if the ranch didn't live up to whatever she was imagining. "She's welcome anytime," Jake told Maria. "Just let me know when." As winter deepened and the ranch settled into quiet months of indoor projects, Jake spent his evenings reading William's journal by the fireplace he'd restored in the living room. Rex would curl up beside his chair, and together they would plan the next phase of improvements. William's dreams for the property were becoming Jake's dreams, and Jake was beginning to understand that finding the buried money had been just the beginning of what the ranch had to offer. Spring arrived early at the ranch, bringing with it a sense of renewal that Jake felt in his bones. The desert landscape transformed overnight, with wildflowers blooming in unexpected places and the cottonwood trees along the creek bursting into fresh green leaves. Rex spent hours each day exploring the property, his tail wagging as he discovered new scents and sights that winter had hidden away. Jake's daughter Emma was scheduled to visit for her spring break, and he threw himself into preparations with nervous energy. He wanted everything to be perfect, to show her that her father had finally become the man he'd always wanted to be. The spare bedroom was painted soft yellow with white trim, and Jake had built a window seat where Emma could sit and look out over the desert. But Emma wasn't the only visitor Jake was expecting. Martha Henderson had been dropping hints about a reporter from a major magazine who wanted to write a feature story about the ranch. The attention made Jake uncomfortable, especially since he was still keeping William's secrets. But he understood that the story had captured people's imagination in ways he hadn't anticipated. 3 days before Emma's arrival, Jake made a discovery that changed everything once again. He was working in the area where the new barn was going to be built, following William's detailed construction plans from the journal, when Rex began exhibiting the same behavior that had led to finding the buried money. This time, the dog was focused on a section of ground about 50 yards from the house, near what William had marked in his sketches as the old equipment shed. Jake had assumed the shed had been torn down years ago, but as he began digging where Rex indicated, he quickly realized that the building hadn't been demolished. It had been buried. The shed was about 10 feet underground, preserved perfectly in the dry desert soil. It took Jake 2 days of careful excavation to uncover the entrance, an old wooden door that opened to reveal a small underground room that William had apparently used as a workshop and storage area. Inside, Jake found far more than old farming equipment. William had been an inventor, and the underground workshop contained dozens of detailed drawings and prototypes for various mechanical devices. Some were clearly ahead of their time, plans for solar-powered, irrigation systems and wind-generated electricity that wouldn't become commercially viable for decades. But the most significant discovery was a second journal, this one technical rather than personal. William had been working on developing more efficient methods for desert agriculture, including a revolutionary water conservation system that could potentially transform farming in arid climates. More importantly, William had been in contact with several major agricultural companies in the 1970s, and copies of correspondence in the workshop indicated that his innovations were valuable enough to attract serious corporate interest. Several companies had made offers to purchase his patents, but William had died before any deals could be finalized. Jake realized that the intellectual property in the underground workshop could be worth far more than the buried money had been. But unlike the cash, these innovations could potentially help other farmers and ranchers struggling with similar challenges in desert environments. Rex seemed particularly interested in a corner of the workshop where William had kept detailed weather records going back 20 years. The dog spent hours lying next to the filing cabinets, as if guarding something important. When Jake investigated the weather records more closely, he discovered that William had been tracking not just typical meteorological data, but also soil moisture levels, groundwater patterns, and seasonal variations in the creek flow. The information was incredibly detailed and could be invaluable for planning agricultural activities on the property. But there was something else in those records that caught Jake's attention. William had noted several instances of unusual seismic activity, small tremors that weren't significant enough to be recorded by official geological surveys, but that seemed to follow a pattern. According to William's notes, these tremors always preceded changes in the creek's flow rate and seemed to originate from somewhere upstream. William had theorized that there was a significant underground water source in the area, possibly large enough to support much more extensive agricultural development than anyone had previously imagined. Jake spent Emma's visit showing her around the property and sharing some of William's agricultural innovations, carefully avoiding any mention of the buried money or the more sensitive discoveries. Emma was captivated by the ranch and especially by Rex, who seemed to understand that she was important to Jake and appointed himself as her personal guardian during her stay. "Dad, this place is amazing," Emma said on her last evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "It's like you found exactly where you were supposed to be." "Sometimes I think it found me," Jake replied, watching Rex patrol the perimeter of the yard with his usual diligence. After Emma returned to California, Jake faced a difficult decision about what to do with William's innovations. The patents had expired, but the underlying science was still valid and potentially valuable. Jake could pursue commercializing the technologies himself, or he could share them freely with the agricultural community. The decision became clearer when Jake received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sarah Chen from the State University's Agricultural Extension program had heard about the ranch through the media coverage and wanted to discuss the sustainable farming pilot program they'd mentioned earlier. During her visit, Jake carefully showed her some of William's less sensitive innovations, presenting them as techniques he'd been experimenting with based on old farming methods. Dr. Chen was immediately excited by the potential applications. These approaches could revolutionize desert agriculture, she told Jake. "Would you be willing to participate in a research program? We could document these methods and share them with farmers throughout the Southwest." Jake agreed, seeing it as a way to honor William's memory while helping other people who were struggling with similar challenges. The collaboration would also provide academic credentials for the innovations, making them more likely to be adopted widely. Rex seemed to approve of Dr. Chen, following her around the property during her visit and even leading her to the creek to show off the natural water source. The dog's behavior reminded Jake once again that Rex had an uncanny ability to judge people's character. As spring progressed into early summer, the ranch continued to evolve. Jake had installed William's irrigation system design, and the results were dramatic. Areas that had been barren scrubland were now producing vegetables and even some small fruit trees that Jake had planted according to William's soil maps. The media attention had brought other opportunities as well. A documentary filmmaker wanted to follow Jake's story over the course of a full year, capturing the ranch's transformation through all 4 seasons. A book publisher had reached out about Jake writing a memoir about buying the ranch for $9 and turning it into a success story. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Martha Henderson brought Jake a framed photograph from the 1970s showing William Riverside standing in front of the house, a German shepherd by his side that looked remarkably similar to Rex. "I thought you should have this," Martha said. "William always said this ranch would find its way to the right person eventually. I think he would be very pleased with what you've done here." Looking at the photograph, Jake felt a deep connection not just to William, but to the land itself and the continuity of dreams that stretched across decades. The ranch had indeed found its way to someone who needed it, just as William had hoped. That evening, as Jake sat on the porch with Rex beside him, He opened William's personal journal to a passage he'd read many times before, but that seemed especially relevant now. The land remembers everyone who cares for it. Someday when I'm gone, I hope someone else will love this place the way I do. I hope they'll understand that the ranch isn't just dirt and buildings. It's possibilities waiting to become real. Jake looked out over his 40 acres of transformed desert, then down at Rex, who was watching the horizon with the same alert attention he'd shown since that first day they'd visited the property together. Everything had started with $9 and a dog's instinct, but it had become something much larger than either of them could have imagined. The ranch was no longer just Jake's fresh start. It was becoming a model for sustainable desert agriculture, a research site for university studies, and a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to give up on their dreams. But more than that, it was home in a way that nowhere else had ever been. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jake made plans for the next phase of the ranch's development. There were still sections of William's underground workshop to explore, more innovations to discover and share with the world. Emma had asked if she could spend part of her summer vacation at the ranch, and Jake was already planning projects they could work on together. The $9 ranch had taught Jake that sometimes the best investments weren't measured in money, but in faith, hard work, and the willingness to see potential where others saw only problems. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you had a loyal dog to help you find exactly what you were looking for, even when you didn't know you were looking for it. 2 years after buying the ranch for $9, Jake Martinez stood in the same spot where he'd first seen Rex digging near the old barn foundation. The landscape around him had been transformed beyond recognition. Where there had once been scrubland and broken buildings, there was now a thriving operation that combined sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, and cutting-edge water conservation techniques. The house had been completely restored, its windows gleaming in the morning sun and solar panels glinting from the roof. The new barn, built exactly according to William Riverside's original plans, housed a state-of-the-art workshop where Jake continued to develop and refine the innovations he'd discovered in the underground chamber. But the most dramatic change was in the fields themselves. Using William's irrigation designs and soil improvement methods, Jake had transformed 20 acres of desert into productive farmland. Vegetables grew in neat rows. Fruit trees provided shade and produce, and experimental crops suggested by Dr. Chen's research team showed promise for expanding desert agriculture throughout the region. The creek that Rex had led him to discover now powered a small hydroelectric generator that supplemented the solar array, making the ranch completely energy independent. Fish ponds fed by the creek provided both food and natural pest control for the crops, creating a sustainable ecosystem that required minimal outside inputs. Emma had spent the entire previous summer at the ranch, working alongside Jake to implement new projects and learning about sustainable farming techniques. She'd grown from a curious visitor into a genuine partner in the ranch's development, bringing fresh ideas and youthful enthusiasm to every challenge they faced. "Dad, I want to study agricultural engineering in college," she'd announced during her last visit. "I want to help design systems like this for other places that need them." The pride Jake felt in that moment was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. His daughter wasn't just visiting the ranch. She was beginning to see it as part of her own future. The ranch had also become a destination for researchers, students, and other farmers interested in sustainable desert agriculture. Jake had built a small guest facility using plans he'd found in William's workshop, and it was usually full of people coming to learn about the techniques being developed on the property. Dr. Chen's research program had documented remarkable results. Crop yields on the ranch were triple what conventional wisdom suggested was possible in the desert climate, while water usage was less than half of typical irrigation-dependent farming. The success had attracted attention from agricultural departments at universities across the Southwest and even internationally, from regions facing similar environmental challenges. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. The state of Nevada had designated the ranch as an official demonstration site for sustainable agriculture, and Jake had been invited to speak at conferences throughout the region about his experiences. During one particularly memorable presentation, Jake had been asked about the secret to his success. He'd looked out at the audience of farmers, researchers, and government officials, then smiled and given the only answer that felt completely honest. "I had help from someone who believed in this place before I ever saw it," he'd said. William Riverside left behind more than just buried money. He left behind a vision of what this land could become. And I had a dog who somehow knew exactly where to dig. Rex, now showing some gray around his muzzle but still alert and energetic, had become something of a celebrity himself. Visitors to the ranch often remarked on the dog's unusual intelligence and his apparent ability to sense things that others missed. Jake had stopped being surprised by Rex's insights and had learned to trust the dog's instincts completely. The financial success of the ranch had exceeded anything Jake could have imagined when he'd walked into the bank with 9 crumpled dollars. The sustainable farming techniques he'd developed were now licensed to other operations throughout the Southwest, providing royalty income that supplemented the ranch's agricultural profits. The documentary about the ranch had won several awards and brought international attention to desert farming innovations, but Jake had also honored William's apparent intentions by establishing a foundation that provided low-interest loans to beginning farmers who wanted to implement sustainable practices. He'd used a portion of William's buried money as seed funding, creating a legacy that would help other people achieve their own agricultural dreams. The underground workshop had yielded additional discoveries over the 2 years since Jake had first found it. William had been working on innovations that were decades ahead of their time, including designs for vertical farming systems and atmospheric water generators that were only now becoming commercially viable. Most intriguingly, Jake had found evidence that William had been in contact with other inventors and researchers throughout the Southwest, sharing information about desert agriculture techniques through an informal network of correspondence. Some of these contacts were still alive, and Jake had begun rebuilding those relationships, creating a modern version of William's collaborative approach to agricultural innovation. On quiet evenings, Jake often sat on the porch with William's journals, reading about the former owner's dreams and comparing them to the reality that now surrounded him. Almost every innovation William had imagined had been implemented, and many had been improved upon with modern technology and scientific understanding. But the most profound change was in Jake himself. The uncertain, struggling mechanic who had walked into the bank 2 years ago had been replaced by a confident entrepreneur and agricultural innovator. He'd discovered capabilities he'd never known he possessed and had built something that would outlast his own lifetime. Emma's college acceptance letter had arrived the previous week. She'd been accepted to the agricultural engineering program at the state university, with a scholarship that would allow her to study without financial stress. Her essay about sustainable farming techniques had impressed the admissions committee, and she'd already been invited to participate in advanced research projects as an undergraduate. "I'm going to come back and help you expand the ranch," she'd told Jake during their celebration dinner. "We could set up training programs, bring in more researchers, maybe even start a sustainable agriculture school." The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities that Jake was still discovering. The ranch that had cost $9 was now worth more than he could have imagined, but its true value couldn't be measured in money. It had given him back his relationship with his daughter, provided him with meaningful work that helped other people, and connected him to a legacy of innovation that would continue long after he was gone. Rex spent his days patrolling the property with the satisfaction of a job well done, occasionally stopping to sniff at the spot where he'd first started digging 2 years ago. Sometimes Jake wondered if the dog remembered that first day, when they'd been desperate enough to offer $9 for 40 acres of scrubland, or if Rex had always known that something extraordinary was waiting to be discovered. As the sun set over the ranch, painting the desert sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jake scratched Rex behind the ears and looked out over everything they'd built together. "What do you think, boy?" he asked quietly. "Ready for the next adventure?" Rex barked once, sharp and clear, just as he had on that first morning when Jake had asked if he was ready for an adventure. Some things, Jake reflected, never changed, and that was exactly as it should be.